Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Stephen Buser, MD, trained in medicine at Duke University and served 12 years as a physician in the U.S. Air Force. He is a graduate of a 2-year clinical training program at the Jung Institute of Chicago and is the co-founder of the Asheville Jung Center. He has worked for over 20 years in private practice psychiatry. He currently works in the field of addiction medicine and serves as publisher of Chiron Publications. He authored DSM-5 Insanely Simplified, Unlocking the Spectrums within DSM-5 and ICD-10, and is co-editor of the newly released book, Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness and the Mind of Donald Trump. Welcome, Stephen Buser, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, it's really exciting to have you here because I've been looking through your book, A Clear and Present Danger, Narcissism in the Era of President Trump, and it just brings so many questions to my mind. But before we get into your book, I just wanted to ask you to maybe talk a little bit about yourself and what your background is, what you do, and what got you interested in writing about narcissism.
Yes, well, certainly. I'm a psychiatrist here in Asheville, North Carolina. I've been in this town, probably 20 to 25 years. I'm a psychiatrist in clinical practice. Over the years, I've been doing mostly outpatient, one-on-one psychiatric counseling, medication management, etc. I had a military scholarship at Duke Medical School, which obligated me for 12 years in the Air Force. And so I served overseas for part of that time and did various psychiatric aspects of working in the military and do a fair amount of addiction work at this time as well. That's my main job. My side job is publisher. We own a small publishing company called Chiron Publications. We've been around 35 years or so, and have 200 to 250 titles now published about a dozen per year. And that's how we got into publishing this book and the related books. There's a book or two we've done more recently that's very much related to that. And I guess it started back in 2015 or 16, I guess 2016. So during the primary elections in the United States, where we had numerous candidates on both sides that were vying for their respective parties' nominations. And I remember going to a talk on narcissism up in Chicago, and I was there for a long weekend. I went back to the hotel room, and in the midst of that, I watched Donald Trump, candidate Trump at that point, just attacking vehemently his opponents in the primary election season, and was just struck by the intense narcissism, arrogance, and bullying tactics that was in the then primary election, and thought, this is alarming. We need to raise awareness of this issue. At the time, I didn't think at all he would win the primary, let alone the general election. But nonetheless, the issue was so intense that I met with a fellow psychiatrist who also runs Chiron Publications with me, and we took it upon ourselves to get this book out really in 3 months. We were shooting for the convention for the Republican Party, but the book was released, I think, like a week or two after that. But within 3 months, we had a number of authors, very widely respected in the Jungian field, brought together a chapter apiece, and we got the book out.
It's a very, very fascinating and somewhat disturbing look at our society, I think,
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
And it brought to mind a whole lot of questions. First of all, how do you think, in terms of this, your theories of narcissism, how do you think President Trump got himself elected? Because you didn't expect it, right? What do you think happened that got him elected in this particular time in our society?
Right, and there are so many different ways to look at that question. Yeah, of course, a conspiracy theorist would be looking at Putin and Russia and was there meddling in the election, which most believe there was to some degree. But even if you take that piece out and say, what if it really were a fair election, and what if he won it? How on earth did somebody of that ilk, win a national election? And again, there's numerous ways to look at it as well. One of the aspects we talk about in our book is the field was ripe for this kind of person to come forth. A strong-willed bully, if needed, make America great again, trying to bring us back into sort of older times where it seemed simpler and white men were in power and seemed to run the world. And a lot of that energy seemed to carry forward. Some of it probably as a pendulum swings back and forth between a very liberal, progressive, President Obama. Obviously many people really enjoyed that leadership under President Obama. A lot didn't as well. So there were many people that were getting enraged at those times to have a black man in the White House and to see progressive, ecologically focused and other things go through. So that builds the counter and the opposite forces to rise as well. The other aspect that we talk about a fair amount in the book is the collective woundedness that the United States has been under over the last decades, with that. Somewhat similar to the way that we as individuals, when we are wounded growing up or in early adulthood, those wounds can predispose us to narcissism or other personality defects. The country, any country, any culture, any group of people can have those same wounds affect the culture in certain ways as well. Meaning, if you look back over the last few decades with that, even from the Vietnam War, but even more recently, the September 11th, 2011 attacks, the decade or more of war that we've been in, the 2008 financial collapse, and others, these wounds bring the Americans, people in the United States, in a way that is painful, and people want healing from that. And much of those wounds have been to knock the United States down a few pegs. Back in the 40s, 50s, and maybe 60s, the United States, was on the top of the world in many ways. Our corporations seem to be global and reaching into every corner of the world. Our army was unsurpassed. We had the only nuclear weapons, at least for a little while. And gradually, over the decades, that's been whittled away. China has developed a very strong economy in many ways, stronger, at least in their growth numbers. And as our kind of preeminence in the world has rusted and tarnished some, I think that is a wound that allows people to be gravitated towards a simple solution of, if we could make America great again, if we had a strong leader, if we had a John Wayne kind of guy in the White House, well, maybe that would bring us back to the good old days. I think that energy, went quite a long way to propel Donald Trump as well.
I was reading after he was elected that there was a move toward authoritarianism in the United States, an attraction to authoritarian leaders. Is there a connection between that and his election, you believe?
I think so. There's that pendulum swinging between, sort of progressive, non-authoritarian leadership style, and President Obama most would feel would really be a good example of that, to the opposite style, somebody who's a strongman kind of archetype, who takes charge, kind of bullies people into things. The Twitter attacks are extreme that President Trump, levies at people. So, yes, I think that the ground, for whatever reason, was fertile, for that. I would take it again to the woundedness, the more we're feeling, beat up in the world, from various elements, the more likely a simplistic authoritarian leader who says, I got the answer and I know exactly what to do. I'm the best builder in the world. I'm the best leader. I run the best companies and I can fix it like nobody else can. I know more about running the military than the generals do. There's a long string of quotes from President Trump just making absurd, bombastic sort of statements that in the past, we would just laugh at, but somehow that energy gets absorbed and accepted, and a certain percentage of society wants to take the simple route, which is, oh yes, he'll fix it. He'll be the big, strong dad that can go in and set the world aright. And it's tempting to have people fall into that, I would think.
It reminds me, as you speak, a little bit like a cult leader, where all the followers abdicate their personal autonomy and let the cult leader make all the decisions. Sort of the cult leader gets to have the one brain, and the followers are like drones who blindly follow and adore the leader. And can you comment on that kind of way of looking at things?
I would certainly hesitate to call him a cult leader, but the dynamics, I think you're right on target, with that. And when you look at the turnover in the White House and the administration, it's extreme, and it's very often that exact piece. As long as you're a yes man, or occasionally woman, that will do what the president says, that will not challenge his authority, that will just go along with everything. You can stay in your position in the White House, but it's almost as if the minute you start thinking for yourself, if you start disagreeing with even a minor aspect of the president's decisions, there's this rage response that is extreme. So it really makes people gun shy. Even people outside the administration, many Republicans in Congress, I'm sure are just abhorred by what they're seeing in the presidency, but they know if they make one comment, out of line, they're going to be blasted, with ferocity, and they avoid that because they know how it's going to affect, their careers potentially. So there's a very much a strong clamp on believe as I believe, or the wrath will come towards you.
When you mentioned the wrath, I realized I forgot to ask you to define narcissism, because obviously narcissistic rage is a main characteristic of narcissism as a condition. Could you speak to that?
Right. There are different ways of defining narcissism. As a psychiatrist yourself, I'm sure you look at DSM-5, and DSM-4 and all the others in the past, as well. The diagnostic manuals that many of us are kind of forced into using, mostly for insurance purposes, will absolutely define narcissism, and there's so many characteristics you need, etc. When you look down that list, it's things like grandiosity, lack of empathy, the need to be right all the time, the need to be adored, by others, the making of these extreme kind of claims, and disregarding, the rights of others. I don't have the DSM-5 in front of me, but early in writing the book, just comparing the 13 or so characteristics, it's striking how they just line kind of right up with the president. Now, you've got to do that a little bit cautiously because many of those criterion are internal, or kind of what's going on inside the president's head. So you have to make some assumptions with that, but it's not very hard to look at the criterion and see. Of course, there's other ways of defining narcissism. There's the Greek mythological piece, looking at Narcissus, and many remember the story of Narcissus falling in love with his reflection in the mirror, and then kind of wasting away because no partner would equal up to the love that he found in this reflection in the mirror. And that's a powerful mythological image of the heart of narcissism, which is inflated self-love, in quotes, because often there's a fragility behind it, because they actually are usually quite wounded early in childhood. But what it appears like is this self-love of of this arrogant, I am so wonderful, piece. But it really trips them up through their life cycle typically.
I agree with you, and I would add a strong sense of over-entitlement, a consistent pattern of exploiting others for their own benefit, and then that rage when they're contradicted and how they feel persecuted when they're contradicted, as opposed to being able to tolerate people having differing points of view. Can you share with me perhaps some of President Trump's behaviors that might show or demonstrate the narcissism within him? Things that he said or things that he's done. For example, his interactions with his wife or with his lovers, or the way he's dealt with his colleagues. Is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head?
Gosh, it's almost the opposite. When you look at President Trump's behaviors, what behaviors don't line up with narcissism? It's absurd when you watch the news, when you read things about President Trump. Almost every single thing he says is nearly cartoonish in how it kind of lines up with a narcissistic personality, which when this book first came out in 2016, it was a little on the edge of, how dare you suggest the president has narcissism. Now it's almost a foregone conclusion. I have almost nobody arguing with me anymore of do you think that the president is a narcissist or not? Well, in the beginning, that was quite common, people getting quite enraged. Now it's almost a foregone conclusion. I'm not talking about the personality disorder. That's a different debate. Can you diagnose somebody without interviewing them? But just the narcissistic qualities. Almost what behavior of President Trump do we see that isn't narcissistic? That's almost more surprising nowadays. But to answer the question more directly, that the bragging is probably the most striking to me, although so much of it is striking. But he'll say these quotes that are just absolutely absurd. I'm the most persecuted, president in American history. And really, more than President Lincoln, more than John F. Kennedy, you're the most persecuted. It's absurd. I'm the best builder there ever was. I know more about the military than anybody else. He's never served in the military. He knows very little about the military. It's gotten so absurd that nobody reports on it anymore. They just kind of expect, well, the tweets will have crazy, bombastic, grandiose elements, within them. The other piece that is most striking to me is the rage you see when anybody counters him. If any judge, if any politician, if any Democrat, if any Republican counters him, you see this narcissistic rage, this torrent of anger that just spews out, which feels like it's right from the elementary school playground. And again, we're so used to it, we don't bat an eye anymore. So, the president's going to say a lot of crazy stuff on Twitter this morning. That's not even news anymore. Well, if any other president had done any of these behaviors, it would have been shocking and newsworthy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this society, it's true that a lot of people have been fired for disagreeing with him, but it seems like also in the small society around him and in the larger society, there are a lot of people who are blindly following and idealizing President Trump. Like, I hear people say, I love President Trump, and I can't get them to actually give me an example of why. They'll say, oh, he's lowering taxes, which is in fact not true, or he's he's pro-Israel, which may or may not be true. But it seems like there are very few things that are lovable about him, and yet people adore him.
Right.
So what is it about people who blindly follow and idealize someone who is narcissistic?
I think it's the energy of Trump. It's the assumptions. And when you're caught in this complex, this kind of Trump complex, if you will, it's really unconscious. It's not conscious awareness. So when you ask people, well, why, they can't give you an answer, not because they don't, aren't trying or are hiding or lying. It's unconscious. It's, in my mind, the draw to that simplistic, good old days, 1950s America. They see Trump and he's he's just cutting through what they see as the BS and just making it really simple. And we just need to go over there and bomb these guys, or just cut off the funds, or just do whatever it is. It's this very simplistic space that resonates of, oh yes, that's kind of like the good old days when America could do what we wanted. We could push people around. We're in control. Yeah, he seems very connected to a simplistic voter. I'm trying to not say that in a mean way, but folks that are just kind of daily laborers or blue collar folks that are fed up with the people in Washington, D.C. If you have somebody who's just giving a simple, we'll just go do this without really thinking through it, that's attractive to many folks. It feels refreshing and liberating to people. But it's on the unconscious level, so they really can't give you a clear reason. And if you argue with them, you'll spin your tires for hours because it's not a conscious awareness, so you can't really engage a person in verbal dialogue easily. That's really caught in that.
Mm-hmm. It's like what you said about the collective wound of the society that we live in, that wound makes people regress into more of a childish way of thinking, and they're not aware of how they are idealizing this bully and believing in them despite all evidence to the contrary.
Right, exactly.
Well, speaking of bullies, I wanted you to comment perhaps on the link between narcissism and fascism, because a lot of people are saying that some of the policies that the Trump, I was going to say regime, but the Trump administration is pursuing are seem to be, leaning toward fascism. And certainly he has a tremendous attraction toward strongmen like Kim in North Korea, right, and Putin in Russia. What would you say about the link between narcissism, extreme narcissism, and fascism?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. In our book, The Clear and Present Danger, Narcissism in the Era of President Trump, there's a entire chapter on that, from Tom Lavin up in Chicago, and Tom really dives into the kind of Nazi Germany parallels, and we want to be careful with that because that can really trigger some very powerful emotions in folks. But if you look at Italy and fascism, we have another chapter on Italian fascism and the rise to power and Mussolini. But certainly Nazi Germany fascism, there do seem to be a lot of parallels with that. If you're going to have a fascist country that's developing, you really need that strongman leader, and then a narcissistic leader, really lends itself to that. Somebody that's so intense, so sure of themselves, so absolutist, so cutting out the bad guys, bullying those that try to oppose him. Those elements certainly line up with fascism, trying to make it a singular kind of one, focus, element. And you look at who he appears to be attracted to, and you're exactly right. Kim Jong-un, North Korea, Putin in Russia, and others. He really seems to connect with the fascist, or at least the despot sort of leaders. And you see him shying away from many of the democracies. It's really quite striking.
Well, I think it goes back to what you were saying about the wound and how that inner wound within the individual and within the society looks to this strong leader and is willing to allow this leader to do whatever as long as they feel quote unquote safe. And I think like you mentioned 9/11, in the wake of more terrorism, it seems like these leaders are able to take advantage of the fears in society and present their agenda, because in fact homegrown terrorism is a much bigger problem in the United States. Gun violence, and it certainly seems like the problem is much more within than externally, and yet these narcissistic strongman leaders are able to capitalize on the fears, the xenophobia, the fears of the other, rather than
Yep.
addressing the real problem, which is that there's, so much violence going on internally.
Very much so. And terrorism is such an opportunity, unfortunately, for that. Those bad, evil terrorists, and I need to keep you safe from them, and I know how to do it, and we're going to send the military over there, and we'll do all these other things. The simplistic yet forceful attack on the other, terrorism being the obvious piece. But even immigration, you look at his response to those bad immigrants, the rapists and the robbers and the murderers coming from Mexico, and they're going to come and hurt you and kill your family. You see this on a brazen, working up of people's fears towards the other. And that's empowering. And obviously Hitler did the very same thing against the Jews of our problems are due to the Jewish people, and they must be attacked aggressively. It's a easy, unfortunately, solution to find a scapegoat that can be attacked through it.
Do you think that when we have a narcissist in a position of power like that, it sort of triggers our own internal narcissism? Because one of the things about a narcissism is they never take responsibility for themselves, and they're always externalizing blame. It's always everybody else's fault. So if we have a narcissist in a position of power, or a narcissistic group of people in positions of power, then it's easier for us to blame the other, to blame the immigrants, to blame
Absolutely.
the Jews, to blame the blacks, to blame the terrorists, rather than looking at what we're doing wrong and how maybe we need to be accountable for our own actions. So it makes us all very lazy, because we can just blame other people and let the people in power make all the decisions for us, rather than looking inward and asking ourselves what we need to do to change ourselves and our society.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's this crowd kind of herd phenomenon where if the leader is rushing in these ways, making simplistic scapegoating assumptions, that we carry into that as well. Because it's the easy solution. We don't have to really think through difficult situations, problems. We can just blame the other. The president's doing it. Why can't we all do it as well?
It's really tragic. And then, of course, there's a whole group of society which is very traumatized by the fact that this administration is now in power. You wrote about post-Trump stress disorder, right? Like PTSD.
Indeed.
And I actually had it. I'm Canadian. I really had like a real emotional crisis when the election hit. I was devastated, and I've never had that reaction to an election either in my own country or in the United States before. What do you make of this? And I'm not certainly by any means the only person who's had this. It seems like quite a lot of people experience the same thing.
Absolutely, and initially I was a little tongue-in-cheek when I thought of the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it really is bona fide, at least in my experience. I've been in private practice for 21 years or so, and at the time when the election was building up, there were so many people on both sides, but in my patient population, it was more the progressives that were getting worried and anxious about Trump. Certainly a lot of conservatives were getting anxious about Hillary Clinton, but that anxiety was building stronger and stronger with Trump. And when he won, supposedly, the fallout was huge. And I saw, patient after patient who would come in after the election and say, I can't sleep at night, I'm anxious, I'm worrying, I don't know what's going to happen. You don't think he'll do X, Y, and Z, whatever they were worried about. And actually saw depressive features flare up, even some suicidal pieces that weren't solely related to that. These folks were dealing with suicidal impulses before that, but that trauma got triggered by it. And even more so for those patients I had that were maybe traumatized in other ways, or they were immigrants or connected to immigrants, or they were minorities. Trump was so aggressive towards non-white America that if you weren't in that role, it really triggers some pretty strong anxiety and even depression symptoms. And I was seeing it every day in my practice. It was very striking. And no other presidential election had I seen it like that. Slight symptoms here and there, but nothing like after President Trump won.
For sure. I just remember feeling so horrified that somebody like this could actually be elected to be the president of the United States, and it really affected my view of humanity, and I was trying to figure out why. How could this have happened, right? And that's why I was reading.
We all assumed it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
I mean, all the polls were so alongside Hillary Clinton. All of us went in that evening thinking, oh, this is going to be a shoo-in. So when he won, not only was there that this person is just so strikingly difficult, but there was the surprise of nobody predicted it virtually. Everybody was assuming Hillary Clinton was going to win.
Yeah, it's a very, what do they say, interesting times, right?
Indeed, very much so.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to say about this topic before we start to wrap up? Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners about this?
There was a follow-up book that we did last year on this, and it was around the time, I'm sure you remember, as the same narcissistic features were being focused on Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And supposedly they've gotten along since then, that most of us don't really believe. But leading up to that, he was calling Kim Jong-un names. He was taunting him to almost launch his weapons. He was saying, my nuclear button is bigger than your nuclear button. He was calling him Rocket Man. And just escalating this threat of nuclear war. So much so that we pulled together experts on nuclear warfare, on politics, on numerous areas, looking at really that specific piece. And that book, which is Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness and the Mind of Donald Trump, took that next step of, if we do have somebody with these extreme narcissistic features in the White House, what risk is that putting the world at? And the biggest one in my mind isn't the trade war, isn't the economy, it's nuclear warfare, because that could be really the end of the planet if enough of an exchange of nuclear weapons, went across the continents. It could really devastate the planet. And this man has his finger literally on the nuclear button and could launch that at any time. My own background in the Air Force included looking at fitness for duty evaluations for people that were working with nuclear weaponry. And when I look at the standards of who we let around nuclear weapons, even to load the bombs that are being in nuclear silos, the standards and reliability are such that President Trump would never be allowed to be around nuclear weapons, in my opinion. Yet he's the one that has finger on the button. So that issue, I think, is important for any president, but with this president, with the behaviors we're seeing, the fact that he's got the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet as disposal, he doesn't need congressional approval to launch the weapons. The weapons would be in the air within 5 minutes from his desire to launch them. That's a scary scenario, and one that we've been lulled into the sense of, that would never happen anymore after the 1950s and 60s. But in reality, it's at high risk of that scenario potentially happening.
And it appears that the pressure of people disagreeing with him and investigating all his crimes has gotten President Trump more stressed and apparently it seems more unstable. Would you comment on that?
Yes, it feels like that house of cards that keeps building and building and tightening. And more evidence of more and more crimes are surfacing, and more efforts to restrict people's access to the Mueller report and testimonies. It certainly doesn't look good for where that's going to end up, either in a totalitarian response of I can do whatever I want and nobody can stop me, which would be kind of a fascist space, or equally dangerous, a eruption of potentially the truth of what he's been doing, in which case now you have a deeply wounded president that could be very risky for distracting the American public, and nothing would distract more than a limited or a full-scale nuclear war.
Well, that's pretty terrifying.
It is. So much so that there's 2 bills in Congress that are really important. We were talking about a call to action a little bit earlier of what can we do with this? There's two bills, House Bill 669 and Senate Bill 200, that were actually first put forth under President Obama before we had any clue that President Trump may be elected. And those two bills simply say that it would be unlawful for a president of the United States to initiate a first strike nuclear attack against any country. It doesn't say we couldn't retaliate. If Russia attacked us, we could attack back. Same with North Korea. It only says that the Congress would need to approve a first strike before that would occur. And that would effectively put a safety on the nuclear gun, so that instead of an impulsive 5-minute decision and the nuclear missiles are in the air, there would be a slow down process of, wait a minute, is this a reasonable attack that could possibly end the planet? Let's think about this a little bit before we take such drastic efforts. Yet, despite that being, in my mind, such common sense of in this day and age with a nuclear fleet of submarines that could easily counterattack if ever needed, we don't need our weapons on a hair-trigger system. Yet, the politics have pulled these bills into stagnation because the Republicans don't want that safety put in place. They don't want it to look bad for the current president. But it's a real threat and really needs to be looked at more so.
Well, I'm so glad you put it out there, because I think people really need to understand how dire the situation really is. And I think, combined with our idealization of the narcissist, there's also an enormous amount of denial of what they're capable of.
Right, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Well, to end on that happy note, what are you up to these days?
Almost the exact opposite, believe it or not. The Korean pop band BTS has taken a huge liking to one of our main authors. Murray Stein is one of the foremost Jungian authors, and they actually named their latest album, that is climbing the charts extremely fast, Map of the Soul Persona. And that's after a different book that Murray Stein wrote earlier. So we actually have released a week ago a new kind of book called Map of the Soul Persona, The Faces We Wear, or something similar to that. And it's been really a delight to shift out of this dark, narcissistic, the world's going to explode in nuclear fire, to a young generation of people, typically in their teens and 20s, of trying to interest them in internal exploration, in what is our personas, what are the masks that we wear, what's our unconscious, what's our ego, what's the shadow. Because so much of what we've been talking about today is about people not understanding what their shadow is, not understanding how their ego and persona interact, and thus coming across narcissistically or as bullies. But if we can help teach a younger generation to be more self-aware of ego, shadow, persona, anima, etc., that would be a good progression, for our planet, and maybe people would be less likely to be caught up by some of these narcissistic leaders in the future.
Oh, that's very hopeful. And where can people find you if they're interested in exploring your work and your books that you guys publish?
Right, many areas, but our main website, Chiron Publications, and it's Chiron like the Greek centaur, so CHIRON, publications.com, is the main publishing website. We've got all 200 plus books up there. Of course, Amazon, if you go to Amazon or Barnes & Nobles, or even better, your local bookstore, and just type in any of the books, Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness, and the Mind of Donald Trump, Clear and Present Danger, Narcissism, and the President Trump, or just our name, they'll pop up, pretty readily with that. So any of the online or our main website.
And I know you gave a little bit of a mini call to action earlier, but can you make a formal call to action to wind up our conversation today?
I would try to end on a hopeful note with that as well, which is that self-exploration of, as easy or tempting as it is to beat up on Donald Trump, because we see so many behaviors that we tend to disagree with. There's a little bit of take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of your neighbor's eye, in that we need to examine our own narcissism, our own wounds, our own sense of grandiosity at times, our own blind spots, our own shadows. So if we can look inward and see what part we've had in this narcissistic culture, that we're surrounded in, and deal with our own elements of that, that's our one little piece to try to move the world, forward with that. And of course, if we were all doing that, probably a President Trump wouldn't be elected, and we would be electing, more reasonable leaders.
That's a wonderful call to action. I really appreciate you ending on that positive note. And I want to thank you for coming to talk with us today. It's really, really fun to have this discussion with you.
Absolutely. It was a delight to talk with you as well. Thank you so much for having me.
That was the brilliant Dr. Stephen Buser, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it on iTunes, and you can sign up for my free monthly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll learn about my new online courses.